Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. So the big news in longevity circles this week seems to be Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. appearing on the Joe Rogan podcast. They talked about a lot of stuff, but among that was RFK's desire to see several peptides that are currently illegal to compound in the United States moved back onto the FDA's bulk drug substances list that would make it legal to compound in the United States. And I know peptides are a super hot topic right now. So I thought what I would do is take you through the video and react to some of the conversation as it's happening and try to help you decipher, what's accurate, what's maybe a little bit misleading or inaccurate. So let's dive right in.
Which brings me to peptides. Like, where are we at right now on peptides and getting them regulated and making sure it's not this weird gray area? Because we know they're effective.
Whoa, wait a minute. So, so we made it 5 seconds before we get to the first fact check. So that, first of all, is just a blatantly false statement. He said, we know they're effective. In fact, we don't know in the majority of cases whether or not these peptides are effective. That is really the biggest problem in the whole peptide space. And unfortunately, blanket untrue statements like this create a situation where people mistakenly come to believe that we do in fact have high quality evidence supporting the idea that peptides work. So first of all, let's take a step back. Peptides are a very broad category of biological agents. So even just saying peptides are effective is like saying drugs are effective. Some drugs are, some drugs aren't. Some peptides are, some peptides aren't. Some peptides have efficacy, some don't. And of those that do have any level of efficacy, only a very, very, very few have been shown to have high efficacy, meaning that they have large effect sizes and work for most people. Think GLP-1 agonists. So that certainly by far is the category of peptide drugs that we have the most data on safety and efficacy for. And many GLP-1 agonists are extremely effective. So that's an example of a peptide that is effective, and it's very effective for many people. But outside of the very few, like GLP-1 agonists, that are FDA approved, in the vast majority of cases, we really simply don't know with any certainty which ones work and which ones don't, because we don't have the high quality data to determine that. So unfortunately, Joe just amplified the big lie in peptide world. And I would say to anyone who wants to claim we know peptides work, if you in fact know your favorite peptide is effective, then please show us the data, the actual real data, I mean, not a story about how your father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate miraculously recovered from some horrific injury because of peptides. If you're not able to show us the data, what you're doing is operating on faith and stating it as fact, which is a pretty bad idea when we're talking about putting potentially toxic bioactive agents into your body. Okay, so let's get back to it.
That there's a lot of pushback on peptides.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of peptides. I've used them myself and used them with really good effect, on a couple of injuries.
Okay, so in this case, RFK is talking about his own personal experience, which is fine. I talk about my own personal experience on this podcast all the time. I would prefer that he was a bit more specific. Again, as I just said, peptides are a broad class of biologically active molecules. So saying I've had good experience with peptides is like saying I've had good experience with medications. And I've used medications to really good effect on a couple of injuries. I mean, that's probably true, but it's not informative. And unfortunately, in my opinion at least, in addition to being unscientific, it's misleading and unhelpful to the entire dialogue to talk as if all peptides are similar or the same. They just aren't.
What happened was there were 19 peptides that you can, just so people understand, there was a law written that to allow compounding pharmacies to make compounds that were part of approved drugs. So, part of approved ingredients of approved drugs, to make them individually for patients who did not have access to the particular formulation that they needed to fit them. Maybe if they had an allergy to the commercial brand or whatever. And the compounding pharmacies, and peptides was part of that group. There were 19 peptides that were widely formulated by compounding pharmacies during the Biden administration.
So what he started to say was pretty accurate. And then when he said those 19 peptides were part of that group, that's not actually true. So it is true that legislation was passed that allowed the compounding of approved drugs for certain uses where the brand drug wasn't appropriate for whatever reason, different dose or different formulation necessary for that patient, or components of approved drugs. These peptides were never part of that because these peptides are not part of approved drugs. That is not true. Some molecules have been put onto the bulk drug lists that are not part of approved drugs, where FDA has said, while we are reviewing these, or until we reach a decision, we will not enforce the prohibition about compounding these molecules. So I just want to be clear, it was never the case that these 19 or whatever peptides were actually part of approved drugs. They aren't. That's part of the problem here. Okay.
They illegally move those to Category 2, which says do not formulate. It was illegal because they're not supposed to do that unless there's a safety signal. And they didn't have a safety signal. They're not allowed to look at efficacy. They're not allowed to say, well, we don't believe these are efficacious or whatever. They can only look at safety. They move those to Category 2, which means do not formulate. Well, what happened?
Okay, this is going to take a minute to unpack. There's some truth here, and there's some things that are not quite accurate. So first, the truth. It is correct that the FDA moved a set of peptides into Category 2 in late 2023. And that meant that compounding pharmacies were no longer legally allowed to compound those specific peptides for human use. Specifically, and you can go look this up, I'd encourage you to do it, the FDA's Category 2 page shows multiple peptides added on September 29th, 2023. And these include a lot of the names that anybody in peptide world is going to recognize: BPC 157, Epitalon, GHK-Cu, GHRP2, GHRP6, Ipamorelin, MOTC, Cmax, thymosin beta-4 fragment, and several others. So it is true that these peptides were moved on the Category 2 list, which prohibits them from being legally compounded for human use in the United States. Whether it's 19 or not, I think is a little bit of a definition issue, but it doesn't really matter. It's directionally correct. And a bunch of these are the common peptides that are being used in the functional medicine, longevity medicine, wellness world right now. So again, go to the website, check it out. It is not true that it was illegal for FDA to do this. It is absolutely not true that FDA is not allowed to consider efficacy in this decision. And it is absolutely not true that there was no safety signal. In fact, if you go to this webpage, you will see that for every peptide, the FDA gives their rationale for why they moved these things onto the Category 2 list, which talks about safety. It's explicitly listed for every peptide. The words are actually pretty similar for each of these peptides. And so, for example, for BPC 157, the website says that compounded drugs containing BPC 157 may pose risk for immunogenicity for certain routes of administration and may have complexities with regard to peptide-related impurities and active pharmaceutical ingredient. Characterization. FDA has identified no or only limited safety-related information for the proposed routes of administration. Therefore, the agency lacks sufficient information to know whether the drug would cause harm when administered to humans. And again, pretty similar language across all of the peptides here. So they talk about immunogenicity. This just means that there is a risk of allergic reaction. And I think their concern is that this has been seen with other peptide formulations or other compounded medications. Perhaps what RFK is referring to is that FDA did not explicitly report for each individual peptide evidence that people have been seriously harmed or have died from that peptide. And this is true for BPC 157. And that's a valid criticism. Like, they didn't show, or they didn't at least talk about, for this specific peptide we're moving onto the category 2 list, we have specific evidence that it is potentially going to be harmful. So that's reasonable. However, as I mentioned, there are numerous cases out there where people have been harmed from compounded peptides, such as the case of the 2 women who were hospitalized and almost died at RADFest in the middle of last year, in the middle of 2025, from peptide injections. And I've talked about that on the podcast. So it is true that BPC 157, as far as I know, has never been shown to kill anybody or to cause super severe adverse reactions. It is also true that people have had super severe adverse reactions to other peptide formulations that have been compounded. So both sides have some merit. I don't think it's completely unreasonable that FDA might take the step of putting these peptides into the category 2 list based on the potential for serious adverse events. And then, as they said, the fact that nobody has come forward with any good data on safety on these peptides. And again, I guess we can each have our opinions about where the burden of proof lies, but I think we'd all feel better if we had real safety data on biologically active compounds that FDA was giving its blessing to be compounded and prescribed to real people. So again, I think there's room for both sides here, but it is not true to say that FDA didn't look at safety or present a rationale for safety. Now, the other piece here about efficacy, where RFK said that FDA isn't allowed to look at efficacy. So my reading of their compounding bulk substances framework explicitly states that FDA is allowed to look at efficacy and in fact should look at efficacy, evidence of effectiveness or lack thereof. That's one of the things that FDA is supposed to review when they are evaluating compounds for the 503A bulks list. So in fact, I've got it here. I will read you from the FDA guidelines what it actually says. And again, we'll link to this so you can download the PDF if you want to. This is on page 9. In conducting its evaluations, FDA reviews the information provided in support of the nomination and other available information to assess each bulk drug substance according to the following 4 criteria. Number 1, the physical and chemical characterization of the substance. Number 2, any safety issues raised by the use of the substance in compounded drug products. So there's the safety piece. Number 3, historical use of the substance in compounded drug products, including information about the medical conditions the substance has been used to treat and any references in peer-reviewed medical literature. Number 4, here we go. The available evidence of effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of a drug product compounded with the substance, if any such evidence exists. So not only are they allowed to look at efficacy, it's one of the 4 criteria that they judge compounds on when deciding whether they should be on the bulk drugs list. Okay, back to the show.
What happened? There was huge demand for peptides. And so a black market came out. And the black market is run by companies that say that they're making the peptides for animal use or for research purposes. And and that peptide now basically completely replaced the legal market. The legal market for peptides, the pharmacies, the compounding pharmacies, were getting those peptides from FDA-inspected facilities, and some of them in India and China, but they were the same one that the pharmaceutical industries are buying them, and we inspect those. So you know you're getting a good product. You know you're getting what you bought, what was advertised. With the gray market, you have no idea, and a lot of this stuff that we've looked at is just, is very, very substandard.
Okay, so again, there's a lot of truth here to what he's saying. It is absolutely true that a black market has sprung up where a lot of people are selling peptides or things that are being advertised as peptides and labeling it for research purposes only or not for human use or for animal use only. and just selling it on the internet. And again, it's absolutely true. This arose in part because the FDA restrictions on compounding these peptides. What I would say isn't true is that simply reversing that or removing them from the Category 2 restrictions is going to guarantee product purity or safety. Again, first of all, I'm personally pretty skeptical that if FDA does take these peptides off of the Category 2 list, that suddenly the black market's going to go away. People are making a lot of money doing this, and they can sell the peptides on the black market cheaper than what a compounding pharmacy is going to charge for the compounded product. So it should have an effect of reducing the black market, but the idea that suddenly it's not going to be a problem anymore, it seems naive to me. But I would say more importantly, again, we've already talked about this, there are a bunch of examples of people being harmed by impurities in compounded formulations that were perfectly legal for compounding pharmacies to formulate. So just because the pharmacies are allowed to compound something doesn't guarantee that there aren't going to be impurities or that they're going to be completely safe. Should get better. So I don't want to say there's going to be no impact of this, but again, plenty of examples of people being harmed by compounded formulations of medications that were legal to be compounded. So in this case, I view this really as an enforcement issue, right? Is FDA actually going to be able to enforce the responsible manufacturing, sourcing, compounding of peptides through the compounding pharmacy pipeline? I don't know about you, but I don't personally see it as likely that FDA is going to do any more effective job at policing the legal compounding of peptides than they have been at enforcing the rampant and blatant illegal compounding and distribution of peptides that is happening right now. So I guess we'll see, but I don't have a lot of faith that the FDA police are going to be on top of stuff and make sure that the legal compounding is going to be all that fantastic. We can hope. All right.
Oh, I'm very anxious to move. Probably not all of those peptides. Some of them are in litigation, but about 14 of them back to making them more accessible. And FDA is in the middle of I think within a couple of weeks we will have announced some kind of new action. And my hope is that they're going to end up with, they're still looking at the science. My hope is that they're going to get moved to a place where people have access from ethical suppliers.
So I want to say I actually support this rule change in many ways. I don't know about all 14 peptides. It's not clear which 14 he's talking about, but there are several peptides that are on the Category 2 list that have been used for many years in functional medicine circles or in wellness circles. And even though we don't have, I would say, clinical trial level data on those peptides, there's a lot of anecdotal data where people have had reported at least some benefits, and where I think the medical professionals in that space know something about safety. And if informed patients want access to those peptides, in my view, they should be able to have access. They need to be informed. I think informed is the key word there. But as long as the patients are fully informed about what we know, what we don't know, what the potential risks might be, what the potential benefits might be, I'm all for giving people access to those peptides under the care of a responsible physician. So I support that part of this. And so I think there is validity and probably some good will come from moving these peptides back into a system that allows responsible medical practitioners to access and prescribe those medications with at least a little bit more reassurance that they're going to be high quality sourced through compounding pharmacies that presumably these physicians have worked with in the past and have some confidence in.
That's ultimately the problem with all this black market stuff, right? A lot of people are getting bogus peptides, and they don't have any idea if they work, whether to test them. They just take a chance. They take a risk. They get a little flyer in their email or something, and they hear from somebody else, I got it from this place. They don't even know, and they try it, and you're getting nonsense, bogus peptides.
I mean, we created the black market.
Yeah. Which we
And
do
it's
with
a very
everything.
dangerous black market.
Which they've done during Prohibition. They're doing it right now with everything else. It's unfortunate.
All right. And that's the end of this conversation. And that, I think, is a good way to end. I think we can all completely agree that it's an unfortunate situation. I guess I would just add that I think people like Joe Rogan need to take some responsibility for creating the black market. And I would say they've done this by propagating incomplete or incorrect information about what is actually known about the safety and efficacy of peptides. They've convinced people that these things are miracle drugs that they need to get access to, that are going to change their lives for the better. And again, it's my position as a scientist who knows something about human biology that in many cases, we don't have anywhere near sufficient quality data for several of the peptides that are under discussion here to know if they're beneficial, who they're going to be beneficial for, what the long-term negative consequences are. And again, that to me is the really unfortunate part of all this. Some of these drugs almost certainly can help a lot of people, but I really don't see, and again, I'm supportive of this change in general, but I really don't see how shifting a few peptides from the category 2 list to the bulk drugs list helps in any way get us the data that we need to figure it all out. What would help for sure is prioritizing and funding real clinical trials on the most promising peptide drugs that aren't under pharmaceutical development, because the pharmaceutical companies aren't going to pay for the clinical trials if they don't have patent protection and they're not developing them internally. And so who's going to step up and pay for that? And this is where I think if anyone in the federal government is listening and you really want to help people, there's your answer. Let's get the data. All right. So with that, I will just leave it to you to really think about, where do you land on peptides? How do you feel about the current state of the discussion around peptides? As always, interested in your comments. Leave your comments and questions below, and we will certainly continue to monitor this topic and bring you more information as we feel that it is sufficiently relevant and important. So thanks again for tuning in to the Optispan podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.